Joey's been working hard, and I appreciate what he's done and what all of you did to help make SALT a good thing, a blessing. And the one thing we need to bear in mind is if souls were benefited, it was a good thing. That's our key all the time. With anything that we do, we need to remember that. Over the past few days, the young people and those older folks that were here as well have been looking at my story. Of course, that's talking about each individual's story. But the reality is that no Christian can talk about my story without talking about his story. And you've seen that. That's been brought up again and again in the lessons that have been presented. Tonight, I thought it was therefore appropriate to talk about one aspect of the life of Christ that really needs to be a hallmark of his people. And that is that he was and is the Lord of compassion. If I'm going to be his follower, then I've got to likewise be an individual of compassion. But what did he do with that compassion? How did it display itself or manifest itself in his life? The answer that we'll look at tonight will involve three different ways that he manifested compassion. The first, Jesus cares for our physical needs. I think that's something that at times we forget. That we begin to think, well, my physical needs are important to me, but, the Lord's got so much to deal with. But the reality is, no, he cares about our physical needs. Look at the book of Matthew, chapter 14, and verse 14. There, Matthew reports, and when Jesus went out, he saw a great multitude, and he was moved with compassion for them and healed their sick. Now you remember that word translated compassion there literally means to be moved to one's inward parts. You feel with someone. I have watched, and I'm sure you have too, as two people who are close to each other, they've been married to one another for a period of sometimes just days, other times years. One of them gets sick. How does the other one respond? Very often they respond with an inward sense of fear, of terror, if you would, in a sort of way. They don't know where this is going, and it troubles them deeply. Jesus had that kind of feeling for people's physical needs. Look again. Matthew chapter 15, beginning at verse 32. You may remember that this story, because it's one of those great feeding stories that happened early on in the ministry of Christ. Now Jesus called his disciples to himself and said, I have compassion on the multitude because they have now continued with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. And I do not want to send them away hungry, lest they faint on the way. Now just stop a minute and think about that. Have you ever gotten so wrapped up in doing something you thought was important that you forgot that the folks that were with you might need a break? They might need something to eat. They might need something to drink. If you're like me, you've done that on occasion. Somebody occasionally has to tap me on the shoulder and say, could we have a little break? We need just pause for just a moment. The Lord instinctively, and because of his inward compassion for people, his feeling with them, knew what they would need. They're out here in the wilderness. They've been here 3 days. They need something to eat. So he goes on. Then his disciples said to him, where could we get enough bread in the wilderness to fill such a great multitude? Jesus said to them, how many loaves do you have? And they said, 7, and a few little fish. So he commanded the multitude to sit down on the ground, and he took the 7 loaves and the fish, and gave thanks, broke them, and gave them to his disciples, and the disciples gave to the multitude. So they all ate and were filled. And they took up 7 large baskets full of the fragments that were left. Now those who ate were 4,000 men, besides women and children. And he sent away the multitude, got into the boat, and came to the region of Magdala. We focus most often on the miracle, and that's appropriate, because the records of the miracles are one of the ways that we know he's the Son of God. And precisely that's what John says in John chapter 20, verses 30 and 31. But in focusing on the miracles, don't forget to see the heart, the compassion, the way that he felt with the people and provided for their physical needs. He cares about our physical needs, even our need for touch. Some years ago, there was discovered an orphanage in Russia that had a tremendously high mortality rate among little children. And psychologists and psychiatrists and people that deal with those kinds of things became concerned. They tried to find the overriding factor that they thought led to this problem. You know what it was? The children were never touched. They'd give them something to eat, and nobody ever held them. They were never rocked in a rocking chair or lovingly held. And it just starved their little beings to death. Touch is vital. Notice that Jesus uses touch. Look at Matthew chapter 20, beginning at verse 29, and see what happened on this occasion. Now, as they went out of Jericho, a great multitude followed him. And behold, 2 blind men sitting by the road, when they heard that Jesus was passing by, cried out, saying, "Have mercy on us, O Lord, Son of David." Then the multitude warned them that they should be quiet. And they cried out all the more, saying, "Have mercy on us, O Lord, Son of David." So Jesus stood still and called them and said, "What do you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Lord, that our eyes be opened." Now, pause just one moment. I want to ask one question. Could he have done that without ever even getting close to them? There's evidence in Scripture that he could have done it, because he did on occasions do that, based on the situation. But watch this one. So Jesus had compassion and touched their eyes, and immediately their eyes received sight, and they followed him. The one that really is remarkable to me is the next one. It's Mark chapter 1, and I can assure you tomorrow I'm going to talk to my typist, because it's not 14, it's 41. That's called transposition, and I can do it as well as anybody, let me promise you. So look at Mark chapter 1, and we're going to pick up and read this story beginning at verse 40. Listen to what happens. Now a leper came to him, imploring him, kneeling down to him, and saying to him, "If you are willing, you can make me clean." Now stop just a minute. Tell me about the leper in the day of Jesus. Wasn't the leper supposed to, when he saw somebody coming, wasn't he supposed to cover his lip and say, "Unclean, unclean"? They couldn't live in the city. They couldn't live close to anybody that was not leprous. They lived their lives isolated. Now, what do you suppose this man needed more than anything else? He said, well, healing from his leprosy. I'm going to contend that maybe he needed touch more than he needed that. Ordinarily, nobody would have touched them because they were, after all, unclean. But listen to verse 41. Then Jesus, moved with compassion, stretched out his hand and touched him and said, I am willing, be cleansed. He knows our need for touch. Oh, of course he knew the need for healing. I'm not arguing against that. But he knew the need for touch, the value of it, the worth of it. If we're going to be his people today, we need to likewise recognize the need for touch. Look, for example, to the story that all of us know. It's often called the parable of the Good Samaritan. But do you remember how that came to be? That a lawyer came to Jesus and the lawyer asked him this question. He's trying to trap him, by the way. And he says, what's the first and greatest commandment? Jesus just turns the tables about as fast as anybody I ever saw. And he says, how do you read? Well, now think about this a minute. He's a lawyer. And to be a lawyer in Israel in that era was to be someone who studied as their life's work the law of Moses. So, in a sense, Jesus is saying, in a kind, chastising way, you're the lawyer. What do you read? Well, then the lawyer immediately responds, and he indicates the first and greatest commandment is love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind. And the second, he said, love thy neighbor as thyself. Jesus says, you've answered well. Now the lawyer's in a real bind. What'd you ask the question for if you already knew the answer? And so, in order to, watch this, justify himself, what did he do? Well, who is my neighbor? And then Jesus told this great parable. Priest and Levite would be very much representative of the law of Moses. When you think about their religious service in that era, these two would stand out in that religious service. And yet they come to this man on the side of the road, this man who has been beaten and left naked to die, and they just pass on by. Oh, yes, I know. The Levite does go over and do that rubbernecking like they do out on I-55 when somebody has a wreck on the other side of the road. He does do that. He walks over and looks, but then he passes by on the other side. Neither one touches him. Neither one has anything to do with him. But along comes, now listen to this, a Samaritan? You're kidding. They thought of them as, well, in old Western language, they'd call them half-breeds. They were outcasts. They called them dogs, wouldn't even talk to them. But the Samaritan saw the man. He went down. He attended to his needs. Not just attended to his needs by putting oil and wine on his sores, but he put him on his own beast of burden. He took him in to an inn. He took care of him all night and left money so that the keeper of the inn could go ahead and provide for the man. And he said, in addition to that, if there's any more needed, I'll pay you when I come back. And then Jesus asked the critical question. Who was neighbor to this man? It's easy. The one that helped him. That's who the neighbor is. You and I are surrounded by neighbors, by people in need. And if we're going to be a true Christ follower, we've got to see the need and reach out to them. I've urged it on more than one occasion. You and I need to look out here, see people who are lonely, who are living the single life. It may be by choice. I'm not even arguing about that. But I can promise you they still need a little touch. They need compassion, physical need. Jesus took care of it. But Jesus also feels our sorrow in death. In the book of Luke, chapter 7, we find a story that may be among the most compelling stories of the New Testament. It is the story of a widow and what happened to her in reference to her only child. Listen to what it says. Start at verse 11. Now it happened the day after that he went into a city called Nain. And many of his disciples went with him, and a large crowd. And when he came near the gate of the city, behold, a dead man was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And a large crowd from the city was with her. When the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her, and said to her, "Do not weep." Then he came and touched the open coffin. And those who carried him stood still. And he said, "Young man, I say to you, arise." So he who was dead sat up and began to speak, and he presented him to his mother. We sometimes sing that song, "Does Jesus Care?" I think this is clear evidence he cares. He cares. When we go out to that cemetery to lay to rest someone very, very dear to us, Jesus cares. He cared for this widow. Didn't, so far as we know her. And yet he could see her plight. He understood her loss. And he felt her sorrow. Had compassion on it. That's really not the only story. In John chapter 11, we have the story of that fellow Lazarus. Now, in days gone by, they used to, in Bible classes, make you answer the roll by responding with a memory verse. Now, I don't know if you've had that around here. If you have it today, I wouldn't know that. I don't do it myself. So I assume nobody else does. That may not be right. But if you leave it up to the children to choose what memory verse, what better verse than one that only has 2 words? Jesus wept. When I did ask people to answer with a memory verse, and they use that verse, I say, you know what? It's fine to use it. Can you tell me why it's important? What's the significance of it? I want all of us to remember that God, in the writing of the Bible, uses what I often call an economy of words. He doesn't say more than he has to say. And it's for that reason that you and I have got a lot of questions. Like, where did Cain get his wife? I mean, I have wondered that myself. He's got to be a relative. I've got that part. But in reality, the Bible doesn't answer that, does it? It doesn't really tell us where he got his wife. And there are a lot of other things that we don't know because an economy of words is used. God is targeting one central theme. Man fell. Here's the way I'm bringing him back. That's the central theme. It flows throughout. And so when you come to John 11, and he takes the time to have John write, Jesus wept, even though it's only 2 words, I'd say it's pretty important. Well, he loved Mary, he loved Martha, and he loved their brother, Lazarus. Why did he weep? I don't know the total answer to that question. But I would suggest to you that whatever the reason is, that the ultimate and the final thing behind it is because he feels our sorrow in death. Then look at Hebrews chapter 2. Hebrews 2 is a passage that as I get older, it seems like I look at more and more. It's a rich passage. And depending on what we're studying at the time, or what I'm studying at the time, I see something there that I think, well, you know what, I haven't highlighted that very well in my own life. And I want to share a little bit of that with you tonight. Look at this, Hebrews 2, beginning at verse 14. Inasmuch then as the children have partaken of flesh and blood. Now pause just a minute. I don't want you to do this moment. When you get ready to leave, just look around. Do we all look alike? No, we don't. No, some of us have gray hair. Some of us have brown hair. HD said some of us have no hair. I'm leaving that to him. We've all got different shades of hair and different types. Some's curly, some's straight. Sometimes the curly-headed ones try to make it straight, and the straight-headed ones try to make it curly. But whatever, we're all different, aren't we? We're all different from each other. And yet, I will tell you that we are all the same. Flesh and blood. Every one of us. There's not one person in here that you can cut them and they will bleed jello. Not one. They're going to bleed blood. Now, depending on the cut, we'll know how much blood we're going to get there. But everyone's going to bleed blood. We have that in common. And that's what he starts with. We are partakers of the same thing. We share in that one characteristic. Then he goes on. He himself, that's talking about Jesus, likewise shared. It's the same word. That word partakers, or partaken, and share both come from the same root. And it means that Jesus joined us in flesh and blood. Now watch, when the angel comes to Joseph, he says he will be Emmanuel, God with us. Or look at John. In John chapter 1 verse 14. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And then see him when he comes to the disciples after his resurrection, Luke chapter 24. And what's among the first things that he does? Touch me. John 20, same thing. Touch me. Feel my hands where the nails went in. Feel my side where the spear went in. And really, wasn't that exactly what he invited Thomas to do when Thomas doubted? Wasn't it the same thing? Touch me. I'm real. I'm flesh and blood. Now, why did he do that? Read on. He shared in the same, that through death he might destroy. That means render incapacitated. He took away all the power the devil had in one giant move. And that's what he's talking about here. That through death he might destroy him who had the power of death, that is the devil. And release those who through fear of death were all their lifetime subject to bondage. I wonder how many of us, if we were really totally honest, could say concerning ourselves that I have sorrow regarding my own death. That I look to that point in time and there is a sense of, well, I don't want to leave anybody. Or something like that. Don't you see that Jesus understood that? And what did he do? He came to eradicate the effects of death. He feels our sorrow when we sorrow because of death. He also wants us to know the power of forgiveness. In Mark chapter 6, verse 34, we hear something that's very similar to what we've read earlier. Listen to what it says. And Jesus, when he came out, saw a great multitude and was moved with compassion for them because they were like sheep not having a shepherd. So he began to teach them many things. What is one of the greatest senses in which they were like sheep without a shepherd? I believe the answer is that they needed the means of forgiveness. That they were wandering away from God because of sin and in their sin. And that forgiveness was vital to bring them back. Look at the book of Luke. I know it's not on your outline. You'll just have to add it. Luke 6, begin at verse 35, and see what it is that Luke writes about Jesus on this particular occasion. Luke 6, start at verse 35. But love your enemies, do good and lend, hoping for nothing in return, and your reward will be great, and you will be sons of the Most High. For he is kind to the unthankful and evil. Therefore, be merciful, just as your Father also is merciful. Judge not, and you shall not be judged. Condemn not, and you shall not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. What more do we need? It's my sin that's keeping me away from God. Isaiah 59, 1 and 2. I need forgiveness. And Jesus, in his compassion, taught about that need for forgiveness. Again, in Luke chapter 15, we see the story of the prodigal son. That's usually the way we describe it anyway. Goes off, wastes his father's money in riotous living. His brother accuses him of wasting with the harlots. I don't know whether that's true or not, but that's what the accusation is, at least. And then he finally comes to himself and resolves, I'm going to go back to Dad's house and I'm going to beg to be a servant. He wasn't going to ask to be a son again. He'd not acted like a son. He'd asked Dad for the inheritance that really he shouldn't ask for until after Daddy was dead. And so he goes back to ask to be a slave in the house of his father. And listen to what Jesus says, Luke 15, verse 20. But when he was still a great way off, his father saw him and had compassion, and ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. Maybe I read things and see things there that aren't there, but how do you see somebody a great way off if you're not looking for them? In a modern day setting, I envision this father living on a farm. And I envision him going out every day to the mailbox. But he's not really looking to see about the mail. Every time he gets to the mailbox, he looks down the road in the direction he last saw his son. And this day he sees him coming back. And he runs to greet him. One great thought that I saw as a title for a book is simply this question: will God run? This parable says, yes, he will run. He will run to forgive if we will come back out of our sinfulness. He will forgive us. Matthew chapter 18, verse 27, we find again the Lord speaking, and this time he's describing really what happened when this master came to take an accounting for those that owed him something. Of course, you remember, this fellow owed him 10,000 talents. It literally would have taken years working every day to pay this off. I'm talking about centuries, really, to pay this off. But he begs for forgiveness. And listen, Then the master of that servant was moved with compassion, released him, and forgave him the debt. Really all he asked for was patience. Just be patient, I'll pay you back. You're kidding, right? But the answer is, when God knows that we really understand our need, He's willing to forgive. So here we are, God's people. We need to be a people of compassion. We need to see people's physical needs and desire to fulfill them. We need to see, in addition to that, their need in a time of sorrow and desire to help them at that time. We need to see all of our need for forgiveness. For those within the church, we too struggle at times and need forgiveness. John told us what to do. Confess, and He'll forgive. 1 John 1:9. But what about those outside of Christ? The good news for all of us is Jesus came to be compassionate, to conquer the devil. He gives you the way to conquer him. It's in penitent baptism, Acts 2, verse 38. If you want to follow a truly compassionate Lord, there's no better time than right now